the buzzword for miniature painting is always highlights. It's always highlighting more, but shading is really, really important.
I think you nailed it. Yeah, like a lot of people, when it comes to adding contrast or, shifting values and stuff on miniatures, that the focus tends to be on highlighting, and you're quite right with that. Whereas obviously it's a two-way street.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to Critique Clinic, the video series where we give our patrons and you advice on how you can improve your miniature painting.
We've got some fantastic miniatures to have a look at in this episode, so let's jump in, have a look.
Okay, our first submission is from Al Wu.
He must be a Space Wolf fan.
That must be it.
That must be, yeah.
After spending better part of a year going through the Tyranid half of Leviathan, I decided to try painting other things instead. So here's my first Space Marine. This was a month back, and I know it's not the most exciting model or paint job, but it showcases the issues I have pretty well, I think. For one, my minis tend to lack contrast, especially when glazing. Staying focused on the subtle changes between layers makes it hard for me to keep the overall balance in mind. I feel like I didn't push the values far enough. What looked fine to me at the time ended up too muted, and after many attempts to fix it, I just ended up with visible paint buildup, and it still didn't feel bright or dark enough. Or am I way off about what's wrong with it? I could really use some pointers on several things.
So, Awu, I'm going to call you by your Space Wolf name. I think you've done really, really well. I think you've actually been quite humble about your first Marine, being honest with you. There's some really, really great demonstrations of skill, accuracy, and also just use of the brush on the model. I can completely understand what you were saying about like the texture. As I always mention, like friction and overworking an area, there is a finite point whereby when you continue to do stuff to that area, it will start to mitigate and make the surface not as good a finish quality. And I think that is visible in some areas.
I think part of that as well can kind of come from this maybe like panicked state you get in a little bit.
Yeah,
where
100%.
I think it can be good to, if you're struggling with something, it can be good to take like a 5-10 minute break rather than, quite frantically painting on the model, because I think that's where you can start overworking paint and maybe not waiting long enough for areas to dry and so on.
Definitely. And I think the other thing as well is like, obviously, look, we're not there with you by your side watching how you use the palette and use the paint and the thinness of your dilution, all that kind of stuff. But I was to say with glazing, it's often and 99.9% of the time better to be super thin with the glazes, so that even if you are putting on 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 layers, as long as you're smooth with the brush, you shouldn't get too much texture. And also every application of glaze that you put on the surface will make a smaller incremental change.
Especially if you're allowing like full drying time for each layer as well.
Yeah.
And being really, really patient with it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, obviously, like I know I always bang on about it, but like a hairdryer will always help you with that. But the other thing to be conscious of is just like, with glazing, it is a patience game. That really, really, really is. Like, it's not, as a technique, it's not something that I would recommend you try and do 2 or 3 heavy ones, because that's going to give you way more inconsistency. In general, the model is really, really well done. As I've said, like the stripe on the head, it looks great. The lenses look great.
It's really neat overall. Everything's blocked in really nice and like full opacity as well, which is something we see a lot of painters struggle with, particularly like with metallics. But like, there's no bleeding edges. Everything's been shaded and segmented nicely, which is doing, I always say it, like a fairly simple paint job that's very, very neat and well executed can look a lot better than trying out loads and loads of different techniques. Sometimes simple can be a lot more effective. And I think that's been demonstrated here, because overall a really, really nice clean paint job like this, I would say it is certainly to a high standard.
Definitely,
as we are.
Yeah, there's a few little things obviously, and they're minute things, and we always like to be as honest and transparent as we can here on Critique Clinic. Like, I think the thing when obviously we scrutinised this quite a lot and had a real good look at it. I think one of the things that I instantly noticed was obviously like here on the foot, where you clean the model, you've kind of like chamfered off and got rid of the sort of like the hard edge on this sort of like foot bottom plate armor.
You can see that on the sort of plate further up here a little bit as well. It's just going slightly flat. So I think what's happened here is you've scraped the mold line off, but I don't think that's been done fully in some of these sort of more pitted recess areas.
Yeah, you can see it still.
And then maybe gone a bit too far with some of these areas here. We're starting to see a bit of a flat spot develop. So that's just something to be cautious of. I think me and you quite like sandpaper for areas like that, because it can sort of contour to the shapes a little bit better.
The sanding foams are amazing, and like, again, even pressure with the scalpel that you're using, it's just being really gentle with that. You don't have to, the more pressure you put on with a sharp blade, obviously it's going to take more off, but I think minimal pressure will just nicely and cleanly get rid of those lines if they are on there.
Yeah. In regards to the contrast points that you made in your post, I think that the actual volumes on the armor panels themselves, I think there is a fair amount of contrast there, but I think where you could push it further is actually in the recesses.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure what your technique has been for shading the recess areas. I'm not sure if it's just from from an airbrush or Zenith or something like that, or if you've actually gone in and manually panel lined and recess shaded everything, because it looks a little bit inconsistent to me. So we've got some areas like the really deep grooves in between the armor panels, which look quite dark, but then other areas that I would typically expect to see a recess shade, like on the shoulder panel here, so where the gold meets the blue armor, and then on some other areas as well, like there's this deep recess and sort of groove on the underside of the knee,
and on the upside of the knee, just under the gorget as well.
And then also, again down on the ankle and toe plates and foot plates as well. So I think going in with a really, really dark panel line, not quite black, but a nice dark deep blue, and just like you would for an edge highlight in the recesses, go and individually panel line and segment out everything, because that will add a lot of contrast, because especially where it's on the edges and you've got done for this sort of, box art-esque style, right, with the edge highlights and whatnot, where you've got a really, really bright edge highlight, and then directly next to that, you're going to have these really nice, dark, deep panel lines. That's going to add a lot of contrast, and it's going to add a lot of depth to your model as well, because I think the buzzword for miniature painting is always highlights. It's always highlighting more, but shading is really, really important.
I think you nailed it. Yeah, like a lot of people, when it comes to adding contrast or, shifting values and stuff on miniatures, that the focus tends to be on highlighting, and you're quite right with that. Whereas obviously it's a two-way street. Like, adding shadows to models or recess shading will also make other things look brighter because of there being more darkness there as well. So 100%.
And you're going to hit a sort of ceiling of how bright you can go with your highlights before your models start looking really pastel-y. Especially with like an ultramarines blue like we've sort of got going on here. You can only get so bright and vibrant with this blue before it starts looking like a completely different color.
Yeah.
And the way I would combat that by getting more contrast would be to spend a lot more time on the shading. And it doesn't have to be like a significant portion of the model. It can just be those panel lines, or just be really, really selective. And in just some corners, like on the shoulder panel, right in the bottom corner here, or just on the underside of the knee plates in some of the really, really dark, deep shadows, just push it a lot further with the shading.
Yeah, 100%. I agree completely. I wanted to just tack on as well that, like, even on the piece, I actually really like the color you've done the base as well, like that rusty orange kind of like metal kind of like color. Again, that orange tone that it has works really well with the blue. And again, it's another thing that just helps to add contrast to the model. Like, never forget that, like, the base is just as important on my mind for setting the scene or the framing of the miniature, and also for just visual contrast of the miniature. If the base is very similar, you're obviously going to get lost. Whereas with this, what you've done is perfect, because it's got that orangey brown tone, which just works perfectly with the blue.
Yeah. But overall, a fantastic miniature, like we said. I think don't overthink it too much, because this is a really nice piece. I think perhaps spend some more work on your shading, and also on cleaning up the miniature as well. And I think you'll see some big improvements. Next up, we have C Merchant, who says, "Hi all, thoughts on doing the runes and lines? I had gone for the white look, but didn't really like it. Looked very messy, which was due to bad edge lining, I think. Was one of those ones where I wasn't happy, so I kept adding to it, which made it worse. I stripped the model back and redid the base coat." Seems to be a bit of a theme this week, doesn't it?
Yep. So I completely feel your pain about glow effects on a miniature. Like, it's quite tricky, and I think sometimes when you get in the process of doing it, if it reaches a point where you're unsure that it's looking right, I think you made the right call here to kind of like reset and start again, which is great.
It's that proof as well of, at the end of the day, I think people have a lot of fear with painted models, but ultimately it is a plastic model. You can always strip it and go back and start again if it really does come to that.
Yeah, I totally agree with you on that one.
I just wanted to pull up the box art as reference for this, actually, because I think this model in particular is quite challenging for this sort of effect.
I agree.
Purely because of the color scheme. So you've gone for a similar sort of blue on blue sort of look, which is quite difficult because you've got the blue armor panels with the blue glow, and then it's like, well, what color highlights do I do, right?
Yeah.
So, and one thing that I noticed when actually just taking a look at this box art was the fact of all of the edge highlighting that the Heavy Metal team has done on the armor panels is where there is an absence of the glow effects. So if you look at this leg plate, for example,
the shin,
there's this bright edge highlight here on the blue armor, but anywhere sort of internally on the panel, even though there's an edge here, because there's that glowing recess, they've just completely forgone doing any highlighting on that panel. And I think that's what helps sell the glow effect, is that contrast of you've got a fairly dark, deep panel without any edge highlights on it. and then you've got directly next to it what would typically you'd expect to almost be a recessed shade,
100%.
is actually the glow effect. So it kind of looks like it's emanating from like inside the armor.
I think from looking at it as well, as you zoomed in there, I think potentially there's a desaturated chunky highlight on them, but of the glow color. So it looks like there's a bit of an insinuation.
Like some bright points.
Yeah, so there's like an insinuation. It's very muted, but I think like you're quite right. You said, George, like they've not done the normal armor highlighting because it would kind of like contradict the glow effect, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So where I would apply that advice to you is looking at your sort of attempt here. I'm noticing that you have gone for highlighting some of these panels. I can see like you've got some highlights along here and along here as well. So I'd maybe experiment with if you have stripped it and going for your next attempt, I'd maybe experiment with ignore the edge highlights for now.
Yeah.
You can always add those later, but I would start by just getting a really nice flat armor color base coated, and then just a nice, precise, sharp recess, what would typically be a recess shade, but in this case, it's like a recess glow.
Yeah.
Applying that bright, vibrant sort of turquoise in there to get the glow effects. And then maybe after that's all nice and neatly blocked in, because you've demonstrated your brush control elsewhere on the model with your blocking in of the shoulder panels and the purity seals and things like that. There's not like crazy spills or anything like that. You've got nice smooth coverage, even base coats without any bleed or anything. So you've definitely got the brush skill to do that. So I would get the model to a very simple point where everything is blocked in. You've got the glow just nice and neatly applied. And then rather than going, okay, I'm going to edge highlight every single armor panel, just be very, very selective. You could just put an edge highlight on the top of the knee, on the top of the sort of toe plate around here, maybe experiment a bit more with like the arms and shoulders. And it's going to allow the contrast of that glow to shine through. I'd potentially even go for a slightly darker color for the blue armor, just so that there's a bigger value jump for the glow.
100%. I think going white straight away, like like you can't go any brighter. Like you've reached the apex of the brightness on the miniature. And I think one of the really important things, if you look at the box art, like they start with a turquoise in color, gradually increase, but even the little tiny bits that do appear to be white are kind of like they're minute. They're really, really small.
Less is really more with that sort of thing.
You want to gradually increase the glow effect with layers that are closer to each other in saturation, and then really the brightest point should be tiny and minute, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I completely agree. So I think for your second attempt at this, definitely bear that in mind. Consider some darker colors just so that you can give yourself a bit more room to play with in terms of the glow effects. And like I said, I think less is probably going to be more of the edge highlighting. My advice for this piece may vary depending on miniature, but I think specifically with something like this Terminator Librarian, it is quite complicated with just the amount of runes and things that are on it.
Yeah.
So
it's a very busy model.
It is a very busy model. So sometimes you just need to take your normal approach for other miniatures and just apply them to the scenario, because it can't always be a catch-all.
No, exactly. And just want to end it by just saying like bonus points for picking the best chapter as well. So yeah.
And finally, we have Adriana, who says, would love some feedback on my custom sculpted Corandrus. I'm super proud of how he came out and all the things I improved on, like non-metallic metal and light placement. But any feedback would be appreciated.
So firstly, this is a really, really awesome sculpt, a custom kind of Corandrus model. Great Phoenix Ore, one of my favorites. And I think the sort of like striking kind of like knee down pose is really cool. So I think it's a phenomenal miniature. One of the things I really like about it is that it shows a lot of movement of the miniature as if there's an action has just been done, which I think is quite cool. Like the sword swept back. It's a really nice kind of like intimidating kind of pose, which is just awesome.
Yeah. One thing I noticed from your comment as well was you said about practicing non-metallic metal and you was like starting to see improvement. Which is really, really nice to see, because I think a lot of people fear techniques like non-metallic metal. And the only way to get around that is by practicing stuff, right? And pushing yourself. And it can be tempting when you're doing a bespoke project like a conversion that you spent a lot of time on. It can be quite daunting to the prospect of trying out a technique that you haven't tried before on a piece that maybe means a lot to you.
It's like maximum risk. You don't want to ruin something you've brought into creation and as a labour of love with a paint job that you're not happy with. And we get that.
Yeah, but equally, like what we spoke about with the feedback a moment ago, it is just plastic model at the end of the day. You can always strip it. You can always work yourself backwards. So I think showing that sort of fearlessness is really, really positive. And I think if you apply that with other techniques in the future, you'll see a lot of improvement very, very rapidly, because things that start out super, super difficult and you might not be very good at, over time and more miniatures, it's only going to improve through repetition and practice. And the non-metallic metal on this, I mean, obviously it's quite a small sculpt as well, and it's quite finite. But I think projects like this are a really good sort of sandbox for experimenting with techniques like that, because it's very, very selective. I think a lot of people go, oh, I want to learn non-metallic metal. Let's paint a Sanguinor, or let's paint
a full Space Marine.
a full,
Yeah.
Stormcast Eternal in gold armor. It's a big project and it's a lot to take on. But something we've spoken about recently on the podcast as well, just finding a model that's just got a little bit of trim, or a sword or something, and just trialing it on that.
Yeah, not giving yourself such a big Everest to climb when you're trying something new. I think it's really important.
Yeah.
So what I'd probably say as the main feedback is this, that although the character is like a stealthy character, and I completely understand why you've put him in like a jungle environment, which again makes total sense. I think one of the things is because the actual colors are very similar, or the tones of green are very similar across the miniature's armor and also on the sort of shrubs and bushes and leaves around him, it does exactly what camouflage needs to do, which is hide the model. So inadvertently you've painted it really well, as in like it's well painted, but I think it's a slight oversight that potentially you could have painted the plants a different tone, be that maybe a bit more muted, or potentially just not have the same kind of value to the rest of the model, which I think is kind of, when we look at this picture, and obviously there are some other pictures that we've looked at, but when we looked at this one specifically, the model does get lost with those plants and bushes.
It's hard to find the sort of silhouette of the model overall, isn't it? I think sometimes it's an example of, it's particularly for display pieces, sometimes you do have to sacrifice a little bit of realism just for readability.
Yeah.
And I think, I would argue you could have even gone for completely different colors, because especially when we're talking about 40K, this is a huge setting, right? So it doesn't need to be a realistic, earth-like jungle with all these green tones. But equally, if you did want to go for green, like you said, I would go for some fairly radically different tones to the greens on the miniature itself, and equally much more variety. So you've got some little shrubs down here on the bottom of the basing.
They could have been different. Yeah,
they could have been different. You've got some big leaves that are different to some of the sort of like ferns and little plants and stuff. So, and look at, if you did want to go for real life reference and you look at a jungle, it's not all going to be thick, lush green that's all identical. There's a lot of browns, and some will be more lime green. So you can have some dead foliage as well. And like one big giant leaf like this isn't necessarily going to be green from top to bottom.
Yeah.
It's going to have, dying leaves towards the tips, or it might be like brown and like scorched from the sun and things like that as well. So it's just adding variety of tones, because that would help separate the foliage even more from the miniature, because it's going to have different variety of colors on it. Because even if the mid-tone was the same green, well, the shading and the highlighting and adding those browns and oranges and things like that are going to be different.
Yeah, I can totally see that you've not gone as high or vibrant with the highlights on the leaves as the armor to help to kind of like do that. But I think, like Georgia said, I think different tones would really help. The scenic aspects of a miniature should be the frame. It should tell the story and the situation, but it shouldn't blur the lines of the silhouette, which this does a little bit. I think as a little tip, one thing I probably would throw in is like with your shading, use like harmonious colors. So like obviously the complement of green is red, but if you were to like maybe shade the leaves towards the bottom with some purple, what that would do is it would add a color on there that works with the palette that's already on there, and also achieves the result of just tinting the leaves a slightly different tone.
You could even go for like reddish browns, sort of warm browns as well.
You could do all manner of things like that with those colors, because they will work with the green. But I think that's the one biggest bit of feedback with this. It's not so much like a technical execution, or that there's not good painting on there.
It's very opinionated as well, isn't it?
Correct. Yeah. It's more a case of it does the perfect job. It hides Karandras perfectly, but that's obviously maybe not what you want to do when you're doing it as like a display piece, if that makes sense, because you want to show off his armor and all the work you put in on the actual miniature. So yeah. That
being said, though, the brushwork and the execution is really, really nice, particularly on a miniature of this scale and this age as well. And is like the composition is really cool. I do like the dynamic movement and the scene you've created. I think just maybe experiment with colors a little bit more would add for a little bit more contrast for the miniature and make it just stand out a little bit more.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, a massive thank you to all of our patrons for submitting for this episode of Critique Clinic. If you would like your miniatures featured in a future episode and to get some feedback from myself and James, check the link in the description of this video. You'll find a link to our Patreon. And over there, you will not only gain access to Critique Clinic, but hundreds of high-quality PDF tutorials, which are updated every single week. We have everything from foundation tutorials to full character masterclasses. Otherwise, a massive thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.